Good Sister Eve. Here we are, episode 2. She had the whole garden, but lost it. The truth about Eve and identity. So picture it. Sicily, 1922. I'm just kidding. But seriously, let's go down the timeline and really paint the picture. Genesis chapter 1, 26. God says, let us make mankind in our image. Right there, identity is established before anything else. They already knew who they were. They were made in his image. They were given dominion. They had authority. Genesis 2. Now we see the environment. Verse 8, there's a garden. Verse 9, everything they need is already provided. Every tree, every provision, everything is good. And then verse 17, a boundary. Do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God sets a boundary. Not to restrict them, but to protect them. And one thing I could tell you, being on this journey, I've come to see that what I thought was a restriction or something being taken from me was actually God's protection. God protected me through boundaries. Then there's verse 17. They were naked and felt no shame, because they were fully covered in God's identity. No insecurity. There was no comparison, no confusion, just truth. What a time to be alive. Then we hit Genesis 3. And here comes the enemy. One version calls him skilled in deceit. Another says clever. And look how he starts. Not with a lie, but with a question. Did God actually say? Literally, did God actually say? And boom, that's how it always begins. He introduces doubt. Then comes partial truth, followed by a lie. You will be like God. But wait. That's my rewound sound effect. Genesis 1:26 already said they were made in his image. So the enemy didn't offer something new. He distorted what was already true. And in verse 7, everything changes. Shame enters the chat. Now they're aware. Now they're covering themselves. Now they're hiding. Verse 8, they even shrink back. Because that's what shame does. Shame makes you hide. Shame makes you shrink yourself. So the same ones who once walked freely with God are now hiding from him. Verse 13, Eve says, the serpent deceived me. And that's the root of it. She was deceived. That is indeed facts. I could think back on a few times I've been deceived. And if we're being totally honest, I could think back about a few times I deceived myself. But here's the hard truth. She had access to an entire garden, but lost it over one tree. And why, you say? I heard you say it. You was like, why? Because she didn't fully stand on who she was. God had already said, you are made in my image. But when you don't know who you are, you become vulnerable to anything. I've spent years vulnerable to many things, situations I've gotten myself into, that had I known who I was and what I stood for, wouldn't fly. If I learned how to properly process certain situations instead of burying them deep and letting them shape me and change my outlook on life, or even changing myself. Eve was the first woman to experience the world before sin. No distortion, no trauma, no brokenness. And yet, twisted truth and doubting God's words took her out. And if we're truthful, how many of us are doing the same thing? Believe in partial truths, holding on to things people said about us, letting the wrong voices shape us, entertaining whispers that were never aligned with what God said in the first place. Because when you don't know who you are, you'll listen to anything. Because when you don't know who you are, you'll accept anything. Because when you don't know who you are, sis, you'll settle for things that were never meant for you. I know I have. I've let some serpents speak into my life. I've made decisions from a place of confusion. I've settled for less when I had access to so much more. I chose the tree when I had a whole garden. Somebody put it on a shirt. So what's the key? How do we protect our identity? We test everything, every thought, every word, every situation. We run it through scripture. Even Jesus modeled this. In Matthew 4, when the enemy spoke to Jesus, just like he was trying to whisper to Eve, he responded with the word, "It is written." For example, the world will try to redefine us. It will make us pick ourselves apart. It will make us question our worth. But scripture clearly says in Psalms 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. So we say, it is written. And sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. The loudest voice isn't even the enemy, it's you. The way you talk about yourself, the way you see yourself. But that's what happens when you don't know who you are. So, ladies, we have to return. We have to rewire our minds back before the fall, back to truth, back to identity, back to who God said we are, before shame, before trauma, before deception entered the picture. Because everything changed in verse 7 when shame entered, when fear entered, when confusion entered. But the good news, we don't have to stay there. I pray this blessed you, stretched you, but more importantly, reminded you of who you are. I like to say, you're not becoming someone new. You're returning to who God already called you to be. Catch you next time.